I'm grateful to be here today, connected to myself and to the world around me, because this still sometimes feels new to me, this being human thing, after spending 14 years lost in the aftermath of a DSM label. My journey into and out of the mental health system has taught me a tremendous amount about what it means to be dehumanized and what it means to reclaim one's humanity. And it's instilled in me an unwavering vision for our future, one that might differ from others you'll be hearing over the next 2 days, because I don't want to reimagine the future of mental health care. I want to imagine a future without mental health care. And the way I'll lay this vision out for you is by sharing how it's come to pass in my own life. I'll expand upon the lessons I've learned through freeing myself from psychiatry, psychology, and the rest of the institutional behemoth I call the mental health industrial complex, or the system with a capital S for short, to sketch out how it might look at the societal level. For this is why I'm here today, to envision a future in which we've reclaimed our humanity from both sides of the medical model coin, mental illness and mental health. And I invite you to join me, whether you work in the system or outside of it, for it's a mission that encompasses us all. I first met the system as a 13-year-old. On the surface, I was put together. I had straight A's, was an accomplished athlete, middle school president, and respected among my peers and teachers. There was nothing on the surface of my life to suggest a reason to struggle. I was an upper middle class white kid, afforded every opportunity I could possibly ask for, and I'd never experienced neglect or trauma. But on the night before 8th grade was set to begin, I had a terrifying moment in front of the bathroom mirror. I lost myself in the reflection, and a stranger stared back at me. It dawned on me that I'd been a pawn my whole life, manipulated by my surroundings to perform in accordance with perfection, but that beneath this facade, I was empty. Confused and frightened, I decided to tuck this away and never tell anyone, pushing down all the emotions that came along with it, especially the despair, powerlessness, and anger. I forced myself to continue on going through the motions of my life. The pressure kept building. Beyond the closed doors of my home, I had no space to release what I was holding within me, so I eventually began to release it all onto my parents instead, through screaming and cursing and physicality. I just didn't know what else to do. Not long after, I'd be sent to my first therapist, who would conclude I was too serious of a case for her and refer me instead to Dr. P, a psychiatrist. After 50 minutes, Dr. P would tell me that my explosive anger was a sign of mania, that I had a lifelong brain disease called bipolar disorder. She would hand me 2 prescriptions for Depakote and Prozac and tell me to have my mom call her to schedule next week's appointment. But what she really did that day was plant in me the seed of a belief that I was fundamentally broken and would have to spend the rest of my life trying to fit into the human race. I was 14. It would take me 5 years to fully surrender my identity to the medical model. I moved through high school with that seed of brokenness planted in me, bouncing in and out of therapy and on and off meds. By the time I arrived at Harvard, I'd reached a breaking point. I'd spent my life working hard to get into an esteemed institution, telling myself year after year, if I just get into an Ivy League school, I'll be okay, I'll be happy. And there I was, I'd made it, and nothing was different. Nothing was okay. I was still just as empty and despairing, and this sent me into a tailspin. I recommitted myself totally to psychiatry, desperate for its promise of resolution to my suffering. When I embraced a mentally ill identity as a teenager and turned myself over to the pursuit of mental health, everything changed. I want to highlight a few of the most dehumanizing lessons I learned. First, I came to surrender my responsibility and accountability as a human being. drinking myself into blackouts and getting myself into dangerous situations that terrified my family? Not my fault. I was manic. Opening myself up to others in short, intense spurts and then disappearing from their lives entirely, ignoring phone calls and emails? That's a pattern that we borderlines have. It's just who I am. Second, I no longer believed that I could grow and evolve, or that my life had options, because I had an incurable, lifelong, serious and persistent mental illness. Eventually, I stopped even thinking about the notion of personal change, no matter how miserable I was in my life. What was the point of trying? Thirdly, the system taught me to equate suffering with brokenness and abnormality, and I came to believe my struggles meant something was wrong with me. Sleepless nights sharing cigarettes with strangers, angry and distraught as my mind raced around the ideas of Foucault and the inescapability of power structures and social expectations, and how in some deep way this all just didn't make sense to me. All of that was promptly reduced in my mind to just another episode of mania, just another manifestation of faulty brain pathology that I'd have to call my doctor about the next day. Fourth, I believed that because my struggle was evidence of my abnormality, the only logical next step would be to intervene upon myself to make it go away, whether this meant via so-called mental health treatment or taking matters of escape into my own hands. As pills and therapy never helped, and I kept getting worse and worse, I was treatment resistant, they said. Escape eventually meant drinking excessively and snorting lines of cocaine until I felt a fleeting tease of happiness and connection. After trying out 14 years of so-called care from America's top psychiatrists and psychologists in America's top psychiatric institutions, escape became the decision one November day in 2008 to walk to the main ocean, write my family a goodbye letter, swallow a month's supply of Lamictal, Lexapro, and Klonopin with a bottle of wine, and feel my body taken over by a warm wave of calm as I slipped into a coma. This was where a treatment-resistant bipolar life took me, to the point at which the promise of death brought me more peace and freedom than I'd ever known. I'd wake up days later in an ICU, devastated and despairing that I'd failed, and would have to go back to the same life as before. At the heart of it all, the system taught me to surrender faith in myself and to place it instead in textbooks and practitioners and pills and institutions. It taught me to fear my mind, my emotions, my struggle, and my entire being. But while all of this would be the architecture of my dehumanization, it would also ultimately frame the outlines of a way out. For I would come to recognize that these lessons I once held as my capital T truth were nothing more than stories. Stories taught to me by institutions profiting from my dependency and dehumanization, however good their intentions may have been. By looking within myself to explore what all of this meant, I was able to begin unlearning these lessons and working towards relearning my humanity instead. A process that's continuing to this day. And how have I done this? My turning point happened in a random bookstore on a May morning in 2010. I was on 5 psychiatric drugs, spending my days as an outpatient at a place we affectionately called the Borderline Center. Always loved that. But there I was, standing among thousands of books, which sometimes offered me a moment of comfort because it reminded me of when I loved to read. I wandered the aisles and found myself face to face with a cover on the new releases display that spoke to me louder than anything had in a long time. On it, a head stared at me with a slew of drug names like lithium, Prozac, Lamictal, and Klonopin written in various sections of its brain. I stared right back, compelled, for I'd had a personal relationship with nearly every single one of those drugs. I didn't know what this book was about, but I knew I had to read it, even if it meant pushing through my drugged haze. I spent the rest of the day absorbing chapter after chapter. I continued on into the evening. I had to. I'd found my stories in the pages of this book. It was called Anatomy of an Epidemic. As I read that day, my mind filled up with questions. I began to wonder if my inability to remember anything, to concentrate, and to think clearly was perhaps being caused by these drugs. If the emptiness, the numbness, the inability to feel connected to anything or anyone might be as well. And what about the absence of sexual function through my adolescence and 20s? The irritable bowel syndrome and chronic joint pain and headaches? What about the 50 pounds I'd gained over the years? Could that too have been the result of these drugs and not from the binge eating disorder I'd been diagnosed with? I began to wonder, if this is all true, if my treatment has been making me sick this whole time, does it mean I might stand a chance at a different future? My heart broke for the young girl I'd been before I met psychiatry, but in one excruciatingly painful and incredibly wonderful day, my life went from having two options, treatment-resistant bipolar disorder or suicide, to having a third, to having another way forward. It was a path I couldn't possibly picture, but in that new space of the unknown, there was something else, and it filled me with a sensation I'd soon remember as hope. In the months that followed, I began to read, think, and reflect on my relationship to the system, even while still making the morning drive to day treatment at the Borderline Center for 6 hours of groups and behavior modification and med management and lunch in the CAF with my fellow patients. I tracked down books like Paula Kaplan's They Say You're Crazy and Joanna Moncrief's Myth of the Chemical Cure. Eventually, I found the writings of Bruce Levine. Anatomy had reignited something deep within me, my human spirit, and it had turned my entire inner framework upside down. I found myself craving more knowledge, curious about the unknown, about who I could be beyond mentally ill. Slowly but surely, I began to wonder if maybe, in fact, I did have agency, and that perhaps I could start to reclaim responsibility for myself. I started to push back against my treatment team and stir the pot in groups by challenging our therapists with statements like, "But isn't the DSM totally invalid?" I told my psychopharmacologist I wanted to come off psychiatric drugs, and when he said no, I kept asking until I realized I didn't need to wait for his permission, and I told him I'd made my decision, and would he support me? My questions and non-compliant actions multiplied until soon I was questioning everything. Soon I was realizing that not only did I have the capacity and the right to say no, but that doing so might just save my life. As I began to reclaim myself, I slowly started to unlearn those lessons I'd been taught about my identity, my suffering, my mind, and my relationship to the world. I came off psychiatric drugs. Way too quickly, I should add, because neither I nor anyone working with me knew anything about what was truly required for a smooth, safe withdrawal. And 5 months after reading Anatomy, there I was, curled in the fetal position on my family's couch, days unshowered, miserable and out of my mind in early withdrawal. Toxic smells emanated from my skin as my body pushed out lithium. The only emotions I was in touch with were uncontrollable rage, despair, and excruciating anxiety. And my only glimpse of relief came from sugar and hours of television. A truth gnawed at me every single hour of every single day in the form of one thought. Laura, the past 14 years of your life didn't have to go the way they did if only you hadn't met the mental health system. I was still full of fear and doubt, but a new insight was taking hold, that I'd been through something catastrophic, and my suffering was somehow connected to this. I began to grieve all that I'd lost in my years as a mental patient, my childhood, my adolescence, my most formative adult years. And I began to realize that the only way to get back to myself was to go through all that pain. When the deeply ingrained urge to tell myself I was mentally ill and broken and could never endure this without professional help emerged in me, an even deeper part of me began to say, "No, Laura, You need to feel this within you. This is important. Don't surrender it. A year later, in 2011, I was at this very hotel for my first ISEPP conference, and just over a year off psychiatric drugs. Some of you may remember me from back then. I was like a deer in headlights, paralyzed by fear and totally disoriented, still trying desperately to make sense of all that had happened to me during my time as a mental patient. I had a quiet voice and next to no confidence in myself. I hid behind hunched shoulders and black clothes and arms crossed tightly across my stomach. Though my fear had told me to skip the conference and stay hidden away from new people and conversations and the stress of travel, something deep in my core compelled me to come to LA to hear Thomas Szasz speak. It was something deep within me saying, "Have faith in yourself." So I went, and my time here 3 years ago helped me see that everything I experienced at the hands of the system was about much more than me and my story. That there was a whole world out there of people who'd been psychiatrized as I had and liberated themselves. Practitioners who saw the harm their professions were causing people. I felt myself opening up to all of this, to a glimmer of camaraderie, solidarity, that beautiful sense of being a part of something. I was slowly discovering that I was, in fact, a part of the human race. Let me summarize what I learned in the system. That I was not responsible and accountable. That I could never fundamentally change who I was. That I was broken. That my suffering was something to be gotten rid of. And most of all, I learned to give up faith in myself and my capacity as a human being and put my faith instead in the system. But through this process of inner exploration, this is what I've learned. I'm a human being in full relationship to the world around me and an active agent in my life, responsible for my emotions, my mind, and my actions. I can grow and change. My suffering and struggle are evidence that I am sensitively attuned to the world and are something to listen to, explore, and learn from. And finally, I've learned I am nothing to be afraid of. I can have faith in my capacity as a human being to be in this world, even when it hurts. And this faith has now expanded outwards, and so I dream big. I dream big about a future beyond the mental health industrial complex that arises from deep transformation in the way we think about what it means to be human. But what's keeping us from this societal transformation? It's become clear to me that the fundamental trap is our ideology, the concepts mental illness, mental health, and even normality itself. Because really, what is normal but a mirage that many of us spend our lives chasing so that we can fit in, feel okay, conform successfully to standards, or whatever it may be that seems to promise to keep us safe from madness. And just as I got caught up in this trap, our society is trapped as well. Today, we are confined by the desperate pursuit of this concept of mental health. 1 in 5 American adults, 1 in 13 American children, and 1 in 4 foster children are on psychiatric drugs. The creep of mental health has made its way into the nooks and crannies of our schools and universities and nursing homes and prisons and workplaces. Parents are called irresponsible and dangerous if they don't send their troubled kids to a shrink. I've even heard stories of schools telling parents their children aren't allowed back until they're put on stimulants. Public figures get caught driving drunk or cheating on their spouses or stealing money and claim mental illness as a self-defense. And should a heinous act of violence occur, we leap to the explanation that it was untreated mental illness. We seek escape from our pain or fear by consuming food, clothes, cars, media, therapy, and pills. The list of just how ensnared we are in this trap goes on and on. So what could a society look like free of these concepts? This is what excites me. This is what my vision is really all about. Every day I'm seeing it more clearly in my own life, and I believe in our collective capacity to manifest it too. To realize this future, our entire social infrastructure, including our economy, government, judicial, health, military, prison, and education systems, would need to be radically transformed. But I believe transformation of these broader social institutions will come only as a byproduct of the transformation that must first happen within us, where we house these concepts that shape how we think about ourselves, our suffering, and our relationships to one another. You could say there are two phases to this vision. In the first phase, we will dismantle the notion of mental illness and mental health and the various industries that thrive in their name, and create spaces for people to liberate themselves from these concepts at the level of consciousness and in the realities of their day-to-day lives. Then, we can move forward to phase 2, in which we free ourselves as a society from the oppressive concept of normal and reclaim what it means to be human. When I think about phase 1 of this vision, it feels important to first name the vital role that social privilege played for me as I freed myself from the system, as this informs what we will need at a broader societal level to support people on their path of psychiatric liberation. When I came off psychiatric drugs, for example, I needed time to heal, access to nutritious food, holistic health care, lots of sleep, and significantly minimized stressors. I needed unconditional support and permission to lose it whenever I needed to without fear of getting sent back to psychiatry. How can we bring those resources I was lucky enough to have to our collective society? I realize this is a big question anchored in complex issues within our political and economic systems, but I believe it's possible if we work together. As we move beyond mental illness and mental health at this phase of the vision, we will still have access to professional help, sanctuaries, and even psychoactive chemicals. But imagine if all of this was separated from efforts to modify people's individual selves so that they align with so-called normal, and was framed instead around supporting people to see their struggles as meaningful responses to what's happening to them in their lives, as inherently political. By this, I mean that the designated problem to intervene upon would no longer be the individual mind that suffers, but rather the world we live in, where people experience oppression, trauma, and struggle every day via classism, racism, sexism, and ableism, among all other forms of social discrimination. If enough of us shifted into this repoliticized framework, we'd realize that as long as we segregate our individual suffering in pill bottles and doctors' offices and the constricted pursuit of mental health, we stand no chance at effectively coming together with our pain to take action upon our world and make it just, equitable, and truly free. Which leads me to the most crucial aspect of this future I envision, the cultivation of grassroots community. I've been involved with a group of people trying to do this in Boston, where we've been coming together in solidarity around psychiatric drug withdrawal. It's rooted in a faith in the human capacity to move through trauma and regenerate. And while its main purpose is to support people coming off meds, what it's really doing is connecting psychiatrized individuals to that third option, that different way forward that Anatomy of an Epidemic once showed me. Eventually, in phase 2, people will come together to dismantle the concept of normal, creating spaces in our communities not solely for those who've been psychiatrized. They will be for all of us, whether we've been labeled mentally ill or not, to come together and reframe what it means to be human. What will these spaces look like? How about neighborhood exchanges in which people come together to offer up skill sets and seek out basic needs? Cooking, massage, an open ear to listen to one's struggle, legal or medical advocacy, etc. What about neighborhood crisis networks in which a group of families offer up their homes as respites to one another when someone finds himself in distress? Friends who come together to take shifts sitting with someone in a non-ordinary state. I imagine these ideas might sound problematic to some for 2 reasons. First, that we've lost touch with the notion of local community altogether and no longer even know our neighbors. And second, that it's scary, dangerous even, to be with someone who is so-called psychotic or so-called suicidal if you're not a paid professional. Well, let's tackle these responses by resisting our self-imposed alienation and getting to know the people in our neighborhoods. And as we leave behind those lessons taught to us by the system and reconnect to a fundamental sense of faith in ourselves, the notion of being with someone and something as unfamiliar and potentially terrifying as psychosis will stop feeling dangerous and impossible and start feeling meaningful and important. I believe these kinds of spaces will make a difference because I can imagine how differently my own life might have gone had I grown up in a culture where I could talk about the strange, frightening experiences I was having as a 13-year-old without being forced into the framework of mental illness and mental health. I think back to my experience before the mirror and I wonder, how did that set me on a path into the system? Why was it that when I confronted the experience and found myself overwhelmed by all the emotions that arose from it, the only choice offered me was a bipolar label and a bottle of Depakote and Prozac? What was driving my parents to take me there? Was there something deeper within me that took me there myself, even if I resisted at the start? Stepping back to ask these questions at the broader societal level, it seems clear to me that there is something much deeper at play. What is it that fuels this fervent belief we have in psychiatry, psychology, and industries of mental health that leads so many of us through the threshold of a psychiatric diagnosis each and every day? These are the questions we must come face to face with if we are to truly reckon with the part we're playing in giving the mental health industrial complex the power it has. We must unpack our most fundamental fears, the ones that lead us to yearn for mental health, for normal. Perhaps it's fear of love and loss and loneliness, fear of death, fear of life. I can't help but wonder that if we start to grapple with these fears and the many ways they manifest themselves in us, would we still feel the need to turn to mental health care? Thank you.